When I am brainstorming basically any sewing project, my thought is always, this would be so much cuter if it was patchwork. And that mindset has carried me into making many, many bags, vests, curtains, Christmas tree skirts, and so many other things. So today I am going to give you my practical guide for making your own patchwork fabric for any project. This is not a quilting tutorial, it is a patchwork tutorial. There is a difference between the two, although patchwork often goes hand in hand with quilting. Patchwork is when you sew together pieces of fabric to create a larger design, and quilting is when you stitch together multiple layers of fabric and or batting. So patchwork definitely can be quilted, but today we are specifically talking about creating our own patchwork fabric that you can use to create other projects. Both patchwork and quilting are massively complex arts that I could probably spend years studying and learning about, teaching about. So my goal here is really to give a beginner's guide and kind of talk through my experiences and how I use patchwork and send you in the direction of success for your first patchwork projects. In this tutorial, we are covering 4 main topics. The first one is choosing your patchwork design and finding inspo. Second, we will talk about planning your patchwork layout on your project. Third, I'm going to give you tips for successful construction. And fourth, and finally, choosing the right fabric and creating a cohesive color story. Jumping right in, choosing your patchwork design and finding inspo. I always start my patchwork projects on Pinterest with a mood board. You don't have to use Pinterest. I know there are a variety of alternatives if you prefer to use another platform. You could even just use Canva or a photo album or throw pictures into a notes app. But planning a mood board somewhere is very helpful. I'm actually going to link my quilt Pinterest board. Not only is it full of cute patchwork ideas, like all of these ones, but it also houses all of the images that I'm going to kind of show and share here today. So if you're looking for a specific quilt that I talk about or patchwork design, you can find the source of that on my Pinterest board. So create a mood board. And to start off, I would recommend really just throwing everything in there that sparks any sort of interest. You can always refine it later. Now that you have some ideas, you may be looking at all of them and thinking, okay, great, but how do I make these? If your ideas are just squares, whether it's checkerboard or like randomly placed squares, that's fairly simple, and we will get back to that in a minute. But in the likely case that all of your design inspirations are not just squares, but a combination of squares and triangles that create a more intricate design, it is probably a quilt block, like one of these. There are so many different blocks, quilt blocks, patchwork blocks. I've been doing patchwork for years, and I feel like I've barely scratched the surface. It feels like I'm constantly seeing new ones or learning the names for ones that I've seen for a long time and I just didn't know that that's what they were called. But I don't want you to ever feel dumb for not knowing the right name of a quilt block or terminology for it, and don't let anybody else make you feel dumb either. You can learn as you go, we can all discover new things, but I do have some of these graphics on my Pinterest board that can help you decipher certain blocks that you may see commonly. So how do you find instructions for making all of these different quilt blocks? I recommend Google. For example, earlier this year, I made a quilted vest. Here it is. It's so beautiful. And I decided that I wanted to make my blocks into sawtooth stars, as you can see here. I think this one is a really good example. This is a very common block. I've seen them around lots of times. Surprisingly, I did not know what they were called until I Googled, I think, quilted star, and then I saw, okay, they're called sawtooth stars, great. And then I Googled sawtooth star tutorial because I had never made one before. And this great tutorial popped up from Diary of a Quilter. Tutorials like these are great because not only do they give you specific construction instructions, which are oftentimes more efficient than you would have dreamed up on your own, but they will also have charts like this one that tells you the exact measurements for your blocks, both the finished measurements of them, but also what size of fabric you need to cut to get your desired finished block size. So the lesson here is to get your patchwork design, however you want to do it, break it up into blocks, whether that is just a square of fabric like this, or whether you are doing actual quilt blocks with a more intricate design, or even something like a half square triangle, which we'll get into very shortly. Once you're working with these blocks or these squares, you can easily do the math you need for your specific project. That way you're not doing the math for all the little squares, right? Like this square, this triangle, this triangle, this triangle, this triangle. We're not doing that. We're doing block math. So if you found a block that you want to do based on an inspiration that you found on your mood board, you're not totally sure what it's called, I bet you could find it on Google or Pinterest, and you could probably find a tutorial for that specific block. And If you would rather just buy a quilt pattern, that is completely okay. Quilt patterns are going to have the exact instructions and fabric requirements that you need. It's all figured out for you. So if that's your speed, that is totally great. Also, a quilt pattern will usually be a more intricate design than just like stars or squares or triangles or something like that. So if you want to do something more fancy pantsy, then a quilt pattern might be the way to go. I also have some quilt patterns pinned on my Pinterest board. So if you're looking for some ones that I find cute, you can browse there. For your first project, I would recommend sticking with something very simple, either just squares or triangles, checkerboard, something like that. If you do decide to go with squares, great choice. It doesn't really get much simpler than that, but there still are a few tips for cutting and constructing that efficiently. So it certainly doesn't hurt to search for tutorials. For example, Jaws Makes Quilts has a great tutorial on making checkerboard with a strip fabric technique. So instead of sewing together each individual square, you're sewing strips of fabric and then splicing those and sewing those together. It sounds more complicated than it is. It's very achievable. So you could look into something like that, or if you want to do squares, but just make them really scrappy and do each square kind of a different fabric or kind of randomly placed cohesive fabrics, whatever, you can absolutely just cut out the squares and stitch them together row by row. Triangles are also fairly simple, but add a little something extra. For example, this quilt, I think it's so cute. This is made from something called half square triangles. So we're not cutting out individual triangles. These start as squares and become triangles. In fact, I recently found this really helpful guide from Stitch Obsessed that walks through different methods for making multiple half square triangles at once. And not only that, but she has provided the math for you so that no matter what method you're using, you just find on the chart the finished block size that you're going for, and then she gives you the math for, okay, if you're using this method and this is the size of block you want, this is the fabric size to cut, this is the method to do it, this is how many squares you'll come out with. For example, I recently made some half square triangles for a tree skirt that I am working on. And I was making this larger block that's made up of 4 half square triangles. So you can see there's like 1 here, and then I made 4 of them and assembled them in this pattern. So basically, I needed to make 4 half square triangles at once, and I wanted each one block, like 1 here, 1, 2, 3, 4. Each one needed to be 6.5 inches. And so her tutorial said, okay, if you want to make 4 at a time, 6.5 inches, this is the method to do it at. This is how big you cut your starting pieces, whatnot. It was very simple, very easy. And there are a lot of tutorials like this set up to help you do things more efficiently, and a lot of them have done the math for you for the blocks. So this leads us right into planning the design layout for your patchwork. At this point, you have mood boarded, you have decided on a design, you have potentially found a tutorial if you're doing a more intricate block or a block you haven't done before. And now you are ready to do your own math to figure out how many blocks you're going to need for your specific project, and therefore how much fabric you need. There are kind of 2 ways that you can go about this. One of which is just to make one big piece of patchwork that is the exact fabric requirement you need for a certain pattern or project. So for example, if you are making a pattern and it says you need 2 yards of fabric, you could just make 2 yards of patchwork fabric and cut your pattern out from that. If you decide to do that, you'll probably end up making a bit of extra waste. You can always hang on to those scraps later, but my preferred method, the way that I usually do patchwork projects, is I make sections of patchwork fabric for each pattern piece that I'm going to make. So if I were to make a dress, I would make a section for the skirt pattern piece, and I would make a section for the bodice and a section for the back bodice and whatever. That way each section is the smallest possible size to be able to cut out that specific pattern piece. But totally fair if that seems overwhelming to you. We're gonna walk through it, but you absolutely can just make a big piece of patchwork in the yardage required. Before we jump into our example that we are going to walk through of figuring out your layout, I do think it's worth mentioning that for my personal patchwork projects, I do not sit down and do the exact math for the exact fabric for each piece of the patchwork that I am going to need. Like, I'm not saying, okay, I need a half a yard of this purple linen and I need a quarter yard of this striped cotton or whatever. Usually I just calculate how many squares or blocks I'm going to need for my patchwork design. And then I look at what fabrics I have on hand and kind of make estimates as to what I'll be able to use. And then I just dive into making the patchwork. Especially since one of the most beautiful things about patchwork is you can use scrap fabric, leftovers, remnants. I very rarely buy fabric intentionally for patchwork projects. So we are going to walk through determining how you would figure out how many patchwork blocks you will need, what size they're going to be, and then I'm going to link a resource I found for determining like exact fabric requirements, like if you want yardage. I'll link that in the description, but if that's not your speed and you're happy to just eyeball it, use remnants, leftovers, I'm right there with you. And if you're just looking for some kind of estimate to go off of for like a medium-sized project, like nothing insanely huge, I would say getting half-yard increments of each fabric is a pretty safe bet. You'll probably be able to use that toward your patchwork to some capacity, and we'll go through figuring out like how many colors and prints and things like that you want. So it is quite individual to what you want to do, but if you really just need someone to tell you, I would say just get half-yard bits of fabric. You may not have quite enough and need to supplement. You may have a little extra and you can use the extra for other projects. That should do ya. Okay, for our example, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through as if we were making a patchwork checkerboard tote bag. I'm going to use pattern piece measurements from my tote bag tutorial that I have. It's on YouTube if you want to go check that out. But all of the pattern pieces are just rectangles, so it makes it really simple. And since the process is the same for all of the pattern pieces, because they're all rectangles, we're just going to walk through the process for the outer bag piece, like the front and the back main piece of the bag. That pattern piece measures 20 inches by 15 inches. And the actual units don't really matter here. We're just using them as number examples. So if you're in centimeters, metric system, the process is the same. We're just in inches for this example. So we need 2 of these pattern pieces. So instead of making 2 pieces of patchwork for the exact same size, I'm actually just going to make one larger piece of patchwork. So instead of doing 2 that are 20 inches by 15 inches, we're going to do 1 that is 20 inches by 30 inches and then just cut it in half afterward. Anywhere where you can consolidate 2 pieces of patchwork, things like rectangles are really easy to do that with. That will make the process more efficient for you. So the first step is that we are going to figure out what the finished size of each individual square in this checkerboard is going to be. This is totally up to you. I'm just thinking, okay, in this checkered bag, I think it makes sense to maybe have like 6 squares going across. If I have 6 squares and my horizontal measurement is 20 inches, 20 divided by 6 is 3 1/3. However, you should always round up to a whole number when doing these patchwork blocks. That will make your life so much easier. So I'm going to round up to 4 inches. So if we have 6 squares that are each 4 inches, that will leave me with 24 inches of fabric horizontally. And then how many squares of fabric would we need vertically to make up the 30 inches? 30 divided by 4 would be 7.5, but we're gonna round up, obviously, because you can't do half a square. So we're going to round up to 8. So our patchwork piece will be 6 squares horizontally, 8 squares vertically, which means in total we need 48 squares, with each square being 4 inches finished. Another tip, I would avoid having your patchwork squares or blocks equal the exact measurement that you need, because it's really easy for little differences in seam allowance to happen, which we'll get to in a little bit, even if you're careful. So if you need 30 inches and your blocks line up to being exactly 30 inches, I would add an extra block on top of that just for insurance. Now it is time to calculate seam allowance. Seam allowance is the amount of fabric that gets eaten up when you're stitching 2 pieces of fabric together. You can see here I have my 2 fabrics, and here on the seam there is this little bit past the stitch that is called seam allowance. We can't just cut our squares 4 inches from the jump, because then every time we stitch them together with another fabric, we're going to lose some of that fabric, and then the finished square size is not going to be 4 inches anymore. It's going to be smaller than that. The seam allowance that I always use when making patchwork is 1/4 inch. I think that's pretty standard, but you could use any seam allowance you want to use. Just keep in mind that the bigger your seam allowance, the larger the seams are going to be on the inside of your patchwork. So in our example here, where we have 6 squares going across, 8 squares going up, we need to add seam allowance everywhere that the square is going to touch or be attached to another square. And don't worry about the edge pieces that aren't going to be attached to anything on the tops or sides or whatever. We won't be cutting right to the edge of the fabric anyway, so that won't matter. Basically, we need to add 1/4 inch of seam allowance on all 4 sides. So like 2 on this side, 2 on this side. 1/4 inch twice is 1/2 inch. So our square measurement that we are going to cut is 4.5 inches, not 4 inches. And then once it's all sewn together, the finished square size will be 4 inches. So now you know what size your squares need to be cut, or strips if you're doing the strip method, but you know what size these squares will be, and you know how many you will need. And all you need to do is follow that exact same process for all the other pattern pieces, like the bottom of the bag or the straps or whatever. And again, if you're looking to calculate exact fabric yardage requirements, I did link a tutorial below on that math. Okay, so we've done the math on a rectangle, but let's say you are doing a project that is not just rectangles, but it has actual pattern pieces like a dress or a vest or whatever that has curves to the pattern pieces, right? All you need to do is make a rectangle that is the size of the pattern piece's widest points. So for example, this is the bodice of one of my dress patterns. And if I wanted to make a patchwork section to cut this out from, I will take the widest point at the width, which is 11.5 inches, and the widest point vertically, which is 16.5 inches. And I would just make a rectangle that size, or whatever the blocks add up to be able to cut that size. And then I can just cut the bodice pattern piece out from that section of patchwork that I make for it. Now you follow the exact same process that we did previously on the rectangle to find exactly how many blocks or squares you need to fit this measurement going horizontally and vertically, and you will have a perfectly sized rectangle of patchwork fabric to cut out your bodice pattern piece. For some pattern pieces, you may have some extra bits of fabric that don't get used, right? Like in this bodice example, there's going to be little cuts of fabric that aren't touched. You could, if you want to, map out exactly where each pattern piece is going to land on your fabric and only make blocks that will exactly touch your pattern piece. Personally, I find the small bits that don't get used to be worth it in the end, just worth the time and effort. And also, if they're somewhat substantial, like if I have a whole block that doesn't get used, I absolutely can use that for other projects later. So I usually don't try to make more complex shapes than rectangles, and nothing really goes to waste. So now we have covered basic squares, but what if you're wanting to do something more intricate than just checkerboard or squares, even if it's just half square triangles? Do not worry, the process is completely the same. As I said earlier, you just need to break all of your designs into blocks and work from there. For example, I'm going to take my vest again because this is exactly what I did when I made the vest. If you're making sawtooth blocks, for example, like I did with this vest, all you need to do, and what I did, was I just figured out how many blocks I wanted going vertically and horizontally, and then I did the math for figuring out, okay, then what size do they need to be to make up the pattern pieces for the vest. And I was able to figure out how many I needed, what size they were. And then as for doing the actual sawtooth stars, I just used the tutorial I found to figure out how to construct them. And it also had that chart for telling you, okay, if they need to be this size, this is how you cut and construct it to be that size. And the same goes for half square triangles, if you're doing Irish chain, if you're doing pinwheels, Missouri stars, flying geese, log cabin, all the fun blocks. Now that the math is out of the way, it is time to talk about construction tips. We're going to start with the basics, which is cutting. It is important to cut your fabric carefully, although in my opinion, I don't think you need to be a freak about it. Especially as a beginner, just do your best and you'll get better with practice. With that said, I highly recommend cutting fabric for your patchwork with a rotary cutter, a cutting mat, and a straight edge. I truly don't know how I would cut these little squares and pieces that you need accurately with scissors. Not only is a rotary cutter so much more precise, but it also is more efficient. You can cut so many lines and squares at once. I just think scissors would take forever. I will link the cutting tools that I use daily in the description. I don't think that it generally matters what brand or what exact ones you get. However, I do swear by my rotary cutter, which is Olfa brand. I've had this thing for 10 years, have never had any issues. I hear actually pretty frequently from people that they hate their rotary cutters, they don't work well, they have to change their blades like after every project, and they're always different brands. I've never heard someone complain about this brand of a rotary cutter. I change my blades like every few months and I sew like every day, basically. They last a long time, I've never had any issues. Anyway, this is not an ad. I just love this thing. It's my sidekick. As for cutting mat, I don't really think it matters exactly what brand you get. My only recommendation would be that you get one that also has some diagonal lines on it as well as like the normal grid. I don't usually use the diagonal much in like garment sewing, but I use it all the time when I'm cutting pieces for patchwork. And then as for the straight edge, I have a couple that I use regularly, a big one and a small one. The small one I very rarely use. The big one I'm using constantly. In fact, this is what I usually grab over like measuring tape if I just need to take a quick measurement of something. This one is 6 by 24 inches. Highly recommend it. I also don't know how you would cut straight lines without a straight edge. It is time for my most asked topic, which is seams. How do you get all of your seams and corners to match up? And first of all, it really is as simple as practice. I'll give you my tips, but at the end of the day, you're just not going to have expert level precision when you are a beginner. I don't even feel like I have expert level precision, and that's okay. In fact, one of my favorite things about patchwork is it does have a very like cozy homemade feel about it, and slight imperfections just add to that. I think there's nothing wrong with, especially like a garment or a bag or whatever, having imperfect corners. And especially if this is for like a garment that you're going to wear, right? You're moving around so much, nobody's going to come up to you and be like, your sawtooth square corners are off by 1/4 inch on your elbow. That's so embarrassing. No one's thinking that. That would be crazy. That would make that person crazy. So the good news is you will get better with practice. It's great to aspire to precision, but don't sweat it, especially when you're starting out. Okay, the first tip is to nest your seams. This is actually something that I learned a couple years into doing patchwork projects. What nesting your seams means is that instead of pressing your seam allowance open flat like this, for example, this is a seam allowance that is pressed open flat. You can see there when I fold it back. Each side of the seam allowance is like splayed open, right? Instead of doing that, which is normally how you do a lot of seams, especially in like garment sewing and things like that, pressing your seams flat is like ideal. However, a better way to do it would be to press your seams to one side of the fabric. Often it's the darker side. I found that that doesn't always work out depending on like what block you're doing and where things lined up. You can't always do it toward the darker side, but it's recommended to do it toward the side that's darker because the seam doesn't show up on the other side. Anyway, you press it to one side, and that way when you line up your seam against another seam, they'll be pressed opposite directions. Okay, here's my example. I have these two bits of fabric that have been sewn together. They each have a seam, and you can see here the seam is pressed to one side instead of being open flat. And so when I go to line up these seams on top of each other, you can see here that they nest together. So this is the seam. It's right on top of the other seam. We're lining it up together, but the seam allowances are going in different directions so that when they line up, the seam allowances butt up against each other and kind of like lock into place. I'll show you on the back side of this quilt block as well. So you can see here in the center of my block where all these seams are coming together, this top seam here and the bottom seam down there are pressed into opposite directions so that I can nest those seams. And then the seam running horizontal here is just one seam, so that's just pressed up. But that will help you get nice, crisp corners and seams that match up quite well. Other tips for lining up seams, you'll want to use a lot of pins. I personally use basting clips instead of pins for most of the sewing that I do in general. These are basting clips. They're just like little clips that you can clip your fabric in place instead of pins. I just think they're faster, but you can use whichever you prefer. Another tip is to not skip pressing with your iron. As with any sewing, pressing is a necessary step. It's something that I used to skip when I very first started sewing because I was like, who irons? This is not 1920. No one uses an iron. Now I love my iron and it's my best friend. So press your fabric, press your seams at every stage. It'll help so much. I also find it helpful to square off your blocks. If you don't know what that is, here's an example. So we're gonna use this block again that you may be sick of seeing. So when you're constructing blocks of patchwork, whether it's, you know, these individual like half square triangles that I've done or like a larger block, the process of sewing them, pressing them, little differences in seam allowance, possibly fabrics that have like a bit more stretch than others, all of these things can add up to tiny imperfections that make your edges of your block, like the sides of your block, be slightly wonky. And then if you're sewing a wonky edge onto another wonky edge and another wonky edge, it all will kind of add up to make everything sort of out of whack. To help with this, I square off my blocks, and I could have squared off my blocks like when I literally made each smaller individual block. I mean, that would probably be the best way to do it. But what I did is I waited until I had this like finished larger block and I squared it off from here. So basically what I did is I laid it on my cutting mat and I cut all of the sides so that they were square and the correct size. Like I knew what size I needed this big finished block to be. And so I laid it on my cutting mat, saw how close or far off I was, and then just like trimmed the edges so that it was nice and square. That's another place where your cutting mat and straight edge come in very handy. I truly don't know how you would do that very efficiently or accurately with scissors. Okay, let's talk about finishing seams. So in a quilt, or something like my quilted vest here, there's the patchwork layer, there's a layer of batting inside, and then there's a solid fabric on the other side. And so I don't need to worry about finishing the seams on the inside of this patchwork. Like these seams are unfinished, right? They're just raw edges. I don't need to worry about that in a quilted piece because all of those seams are going to be hidden by the other layers and secured with the quilting. But when you're making a patchwork item like a dress or a shirt or something where you don't have any sort of lining or backing or quilting, you do need to finish the seams on the inside. Otherwise they will fray and unravel eventually. There are a few different options here of how you can finish those edges. The way that I do it personally and my preferred method would be to use a serger. A serger is a separate machine used for sewing and it trims and finishes raw edges at once. This is an example of a serged edge. This is kind of what the result of using a serger looks like. So if you're going to use a serger, you can straight stitch and then serge your edges, which is what this example shows right here. There's a straight stitch and then a serged edge. I've done patchwork where I've just used my serger, like I use that as a means to attach and finish my edges. That's probably less structurally sound, but like I used it for curtains, right? And that's not something that's getting a lot of wear and tear. If you don't have a serger, you can do an overlocking edge similar to this on your regular sewing machine. I do have a tutorial for doing that you can follow. But just a heads up, for something with as many seams as patchwork, I do think that that would take quite a long time and I would probably not be super happy about doing that, but you can totally do it if you want to do it. Another option is doing French seams. French seams is a method where you sew 2 stitches. Your second stitch encloses your first stitch. You can see here is the seam allowance and there's no raw edge. It's just an enclosed seam there. This is also slightly time consuming because you have to do 2 different stitches, right? But I would probably still prefer to do that over overlocking on your regular sewing machine. And sensory wise, I know that there are a lot of people who prefer the feel of French seams on the inside of a garment. But keep in mind, if you decide to do French seams, you'll need to account for that when you calculate your seam allowance because it is pretty difficult to do 1/4 inch seam allowance with French seams because you're doing 2 different seams, so they would be like really tiny. You could also opt to line your patchwork. I've done this on a dress that I made, which I actually have a very in-depth detailed tutorial for this exact dress if you want to make it. But I decided that I was going to line this dress and have it be like really a quilted dress. It's not just patchwork, it's actually quilted. So I'll show you the inside. This is the patchwork on the outside. The inside of it is fully lined with a thin layer of like really lightweight linen. So you can see there, I attached the lining by quilting it onto the patchwork. So there's no batting or anything in between. It's just 2 layers of fabric. And that works pretty well. The only thing to maybe think about is it does get kind of heavy, especially when you're doing it on something really big like a dress. But it's not too bad, and if you're doing it on smaller projects like bags or tops or whatever, then it really wouldn't be bad at all. My recommendations, probably in order, are serger, French seams, lining, and then overlocking on your regular machine. We are down to the final bit, my very favorite and most exciting part, which is choosing your fabrics. We'll get to color and coordination and all that stuff in a little bit, but first, as far as just choosing the type of fabric you are using, the easiest thing you could work with is quilting cotton, which is a plain weave cotton that has a bit of structure to it, so it does hold a crease. It's very easy to work with, but it doesn't have a lot of drape to it. So if you're trying to make something kind of flowy, you probably don't want to use quilting cottons, although you can, especially if you are a beginner. It is the easiest material to work with. So in weighing your pros and cons, you might want to go with it. For me, I often work with woven cottons and linens with a bit of drape. I particularly love things with a bit of texture to them as well. And Fabulism is a brand that I use a lot. Love their stuff. Their stuff would be great for patchwork because it is a woven cotton. This is just like one of the fabrics I had in my closet. But you can see it's a woven cotton that has a really pretty texture to it. And it does have a bit of like scrunchy drapiness to it too. It's not a stiff quilting cotton. It is quite soft. Highly recommend Fabulism. But I usually just use the same types of fabrics that I make my clothes out of, which again, cottons, linens, wovens. You could also go for shirtings or like yarn dyed wovens, which is what a lot of these are. Even like lightweight denims would work well, chambray. I would just avoid knits or anything with a lot of stretch to it. Throughout the construction process, you want your fabric to stay as structured as possible. Otherwise, seams get kind of funky. I would also avoid anything with a really loose weave like gauze or even like loosely woven linens, just because again, they can like kind of get shifty on you. And you can use multiple different kinds of fabric in one patchwork piece. I would just make sure that they're of similar weight and kind of drape and structure. I often blend cottons and linens together, but I just make sure that they, kind of feel the same. Otherwise, if you have one fabric that's like super loose and drapey and another fabric that's like a really structured quilting cotton, then they aren't going to act the same in the garment. So as long as they have a similar feel, you don't really need to be worrying or thinking about it too much. I would also recommend pre-washing your fabric. That's something that I used to neglect in the past. I'm better at it now, but all fabrics shrink a little bit and shrink it at different rates after you buy them. So pre-wash all of your fabric. And on that note, I don't wash my fabric any sort of fancy special way. I don't like hand wash or use special cycles. I just throw them in like the rest of my clothes because I'm a bit lazy and it always works out. So don't stress too much about that part. If you are looking for places to source fabric from for your patchwork, like I said, I just use the same fabrics that I sew garments with. And so I'm going to link just my like top 5 or 10 favorite fabric stores in the description. But I highly recommend thrifting as well, especially if you're a beginner, trying out patchwork, experimenting. There's so much good fabric at the thrift store. And for patchwork especially, you don't need like actual cuts of fabric or big bed sheets or whatever, even though you can use those as well. But you can cut up like curtains, even small curtains, aprons, placemats, pillowcases, like any smaller cuts of fabric will work great for patchwork. So the options are endless for thrifting. Highly recommend it. And now I have saved the best for last. We're going to talk about colors and kind of creating a color palette or color story and making everything cohesive. Now, I would also consider this to be a practice as well. As a child, I used to, for fun, by my own will, make color palettes in paint. Do we remember paint? I would do all sorts of funky stuff. I would spend hours in this, playing with colors and whatever. So I've always loved playing with colors and prints, and I think a lot of artsy-fartsy kids can kind of relate to that or have similar stories. So I've been doing things like this for a very long time. And so because of that, because I've had all that practice, I do feel like I have a little bit of an eye for it. And if you just haven't had as much practice at it, your first attempts might not be that great, but that's okay. The 3 main things that I would pay attention to are color, tone, and print. Color seems simple, but it can be complex just kind of depending on what you're going for. I'm not even going to tell you like, oh, look for opposite colors on the color wheel, because sometimes your intention is not to have contrasting colors, right? Sometimes you do want a quilt that's maybe more monochromatic or maybe is skewed toward one side or area of the color wheel. So this, again, is where mood boarding really comes into play. Gather all of your inspiration and then get really specific as to why those things are catching your eye. Look for themes in your mood board. Maybe there are certain colors that kind of are woven throughout your mood board or you see popping up over and over again. Sometimes you do want a million colors, and sometimes you just want a couple colors. Sometimes you want colors that are broken up by kind of like white background or splotches in your patchwork. So starting with a few inspiration pictures and going through that mood board is really helpful in deciding what kind of colors you want to do. Onto tone. This is actually maybe my sneakiest tip that you may have not thought about before. I don't know, maybe you have. Personally, I feel like tone is maybe more important when deciding on your color story than the actual colors themselves. You need to have lights and darks kind of balanced throughout to make it visually appealing. I'm gonna show you as an example the tree skirt that I just recently made. Might be kind of hard to get a full picture of it. In fact, I might just put a picture here because it is quite hard to see. I think this is a pretty good example for a variety of tones because color-wise, right? Color-wise, this is all kind of bluish, purplish, reddish, pinkish. It's not like because I decided to have a lot of blues, I also thought, oh, well, I have blues, so I should also have oranges, right? Or because I have reds, I need to have greens. I wanted it to be a little bit more muted or like along the same sort of vibes color-wise, but I did make sure that I had a variety in tones. I'm gonna show you a couple specific blocks. We might be getting too in the weeds here, but I love this stuff. So this block, for example, here that has kind of this muted purple and then this pink with little red hearts to it, right? This tonally is quite similar, right? Like this pink is a little bit lighter than this, but really it all kind of melds together, especially in comparison to something like this block here, which has this really, really light, bright stripe, and then this kind of medium, darkish gingham. That tonally is very different. And then again, here we have something that's tonally a bit similar, right? Like this one's a bit darker, but still in comparison, they're tonally more similar. So you want a mix, both in the overall piece, but also in each individual block you do. Try to have some blocks that are maybe more contrasting and some that are more melded together tonally. Especially when you think about certain color schemes where they're all tonally the same, even if, let's use this color scheme as an example. Colors wise, there's a bunch of different colors, but they're all the same tone. So together, it's kind of just like, ugh. Your eyes don't really know where to look because you're seeing it all at once. And if you balance out the tones a bit more and give some light, some dark, even if they're kind of the same color, it helps guide your eyes and tell them what to focus on. Prints are sort of similar. You definitely can make patchwork fabric just out of solid fabrics. You don't need to have prints in the mix, but I do think it's fun to kind of mix in different prints, like on this patchwork, for example. And you know, you could have stripes, you could have gingham, floral. I've got some bows on here. I've got some little hearts, stripes that are like kind of a shapy stripe. The key here, similar to tone, is to have a variety of prints. So for example, you might want like some ginghams to be bigger ginghams and some hearts, like this is a print, just like a teeny little print heart, or some stripes to be kind of like medium stripes, or like this bow print is kind of a bigger print, right? Especially in comparison to some of these other patterns and prints we have going on. Prints are great, but try to get a variation of scale, I guess, is what I'm saying. And again, that just gives your eye something to kind of focus on and discover and find different things instead of if the scale was all the same, you were using all large prints or all small prints or something, it just becomes a bit monotonous, but also overwhelming. In summary, when choosing your fabrics, create a mood board, be intentional about your colors, and include a balance and variation in tones and prints. So with these things in mind, when I am choosing my fabrics, I go to my fabric closet over there and I just start pulling out anything and everything that could be a promising contender. And I lay them all out on my big table here so that I can kind of see everything clearly. And once I have them all laid out, I start pulling groups of fabrics together, things that kind of look good together, creating little sections, right? And at this stage, you probably have an idea of how many fabrics you want to use. If you're not 100% sure, this process will help you decide exactly how many you want to use. And I just keep comparing, shifting, swapping things out, setting things aside as like definite no's. I have a maybe pile, and then I have like this core group that slowly starts being whittled out of like, okay, these are the colors that are looking good together. And then at this stage, you can look at those core groups of fabric and you can think, Do I have too much of anything? Am I missing anything? Occasionally at this stage, I'll be like, man, if I had a dark green like micro print, this would be perfect. I might end up running to the store and grabbing something to like really balance it out, but usually within just my stash and scraps, I can kind of find a cohesive look. If you are buying fabric online or in person specifically for patchwork, the process is the same. Online, I would recommend being able to see the fabrics together, whether that's like in your cart or if you want to like screenshot and move them into Canva, or some websites have like a favorites button where you can favorite all the fabrics you're looking at and kind of like see them laid out together. I would definitely recommend doing that. It just helps so much to be able to see them that way. In person, it's pretty much the same. A lot of times I monopolize an aisle at the fabric store where I'm like laying things out and kind of keeping things in my cart, and I keep moving them in and out and whatever. If you really want to go the extra mile, you can mock up your patchwork design and specific fabrics for that design on something like Canva or Illustrator, or I think Procreate, you can do that as well. Basically, you would create all the little squares and triangles that you're using for your design, plug in the actual fabrics, colors you're using, and map out exactly where you want every single piece. And no judgment. If that is what you want to do, go for it. I just think that if you are at that level of perfectionism, you might be driving yourself a little more crazy than you need to be. But if you're enjoying it and you're having fun, then it's a great thing. I just certainly don't think you have to do that. Oh boy, you guys, I have chattered your ear off and I still feel like I could talk about patchwork for many more days. But I hope that this overview was helpful in kickstarting your patchwork journey. As a brief summary of everything that we have discussed, start with a small project. Start with a simple patchwork design, whether it's just squares or checkered board or half square triangles. Use fabrics that you already have on hand. Thrifted fabrics would also be great. And learn as you go. You do not have to have everything totally figured out and know what you're doing beforehand. You are going to learn so much just in the process of making your patchwork. In the description, I am going to link a few artists and authors and creators that I follow who are great inspiration for patchwork. A lot of them are quilters, but their designs could be used for other patchwork items as well. It doesn't have to be quilts. And if I could close this out with one word of advice, it would be to please shed the expectation of perfectionism. I sourced questions from my audience of what you guys wanted to know about the patchwork process as I was planning for this. And I was so surprised by the number of times that word perfect or perfection came up in the questions. How do I get perfect corners? How do I choose the perfect fabric? How do I cut my fabric perfectly? And I fear that we're missing the point. We all surely get better with practice, but perfection is such a stressful dream to chase, and it cannot stop you from starting, or should not stop you from starting. Instead of striving for perfection, I encourage you or your goal to be an enjoyable crafting experience and constant improvement, which will just happen naturally the more you practice. I love you all. I appreciate you hanging out with me, and I cannot wait to see your beautiful patchwork creations.